Every day, Madison follows her mother to a mansion she'll never call home. She's only 8, but already understands silence better than most adults. Her mother, Carmen, has worked there for 9 years, loyal, invisible. But when money starts disappearing from the old man's private safe, suspicion falls where it always does, on the quiet and the poor. What no one expects is that a simple act of honesty from a child will unravel a betrayal hidden in plain sight and spark a bond no one saw coming. What would you do if the person you trusted most turned out to be the one stealing from you, and the one you feared was actually the one who'd save you? Stay with us until the end. This story will break something in you, just to rebuild it. Benjamin Walker had spent a lifetime building walls, of brick, of reputation, and most dangerously of silence. That afternoon, when he deliberately left the vault open and the money scattered on his polished desk, he didn't see it as cruelty. He saw it as insurance. Insurance against the decay of trust, against the erosion that begins in the smallest of thefts and ends in the hollowing of the soul. He had seen it before. Friends turned leeches, business partners turned thieves. And now, staring at the possibility that even Carmen Ellis, his most trusted housekeeper, might be complicit, Benjamin told himself it was better to be paranoid than to be fooled. But it wasn't Carmen he planned to test. It was the girl, Madison, 8 years old, a child of few words but many drawings, with a tendency to leave little scribbles in every room like breadcrumbs of innocence. She was always underfoot during school breaks, trailing behind her mother like a shadow. But Benjamin had begun to see her differently. If Carmen had changed, then perhaps the girl had too. If there was rot, it had to start somewhere, so the test wasn't only for Madison, it was for Benjamin himself. Could he still read truth when it stood quietly before him? He positioned the scene carefully, the door left slightly ajar, the vault wide open with its code reset temporarily, a stack of cash purposefully fanned out like fallen leaves across the desk's surface. He checked the hidden camera, camouflaged inside a row of old economics books, then left for his daily walk, though today he only circled the garden once before retreating to the stone bench near his office window, where he could watch the doorway indirectly. He knew her patterns. Around this time, Carmen would be folding linens in the upstairs hallway. Madison would roam, as she always did, notebook in hand, humming half melodies that never quite formed songs. His heart beat faster than usual, not from fear, but from the grim thrill of the trap. And sure enough, after several long minutes, he saw her small frame approach the door, peek inside, and step into the study. She stood there, frozen at first, and Benjamin saw her eyes widen, not with greed, he thought, but confusion. Then she moved closer, cautiously, the way one approaches something sacred or broken. She looked around, then stepped up to the desk. Benjamin's hand trembled slightly over his phone, ready to zoom in, to record if needed. But nothing in his long life of strategy and suspicion had prepared him for what came next. Madison did not snatch at the bills. She did not glance nervously toward the hallway. She did not reach for her pockets or hide anything beneath her dress. Instead, she pulled the small notebook from under her arm, placed it on the corner of the desk, and sat down cross-legged on the floor. With small, deliberate hands, she began to gather the scattered money, not greedily, but with the same precision her mother used when folding napkins for the formal dining table. She flattened the edges of each note, smoothing them down gently, aligning corners like puzzle pieces. Occasionally, she paused to inspect a torn edge or a bent corner, pressing it back into place with care. Benjamin watched in stunned silence. There was no performance here, no suspicion in her eyes, no awareness of being observed. It was as if she had entered a mess someone else had made and simply assumed it was her responsibility to restore order. She began to hum, soft, tuneless, but content, the same way a child might hum while coloring or playing with building blocks. Benjamin felt something crack inside his chest. It was subtle, like the first snap of melting ice. Then just as quietly, Madison stood. She looked at the neatly stacked money, nodded once as if satisfied with her work, then scribbled something onto a torn page from her notebook. She didn't hesitate. The way her small hand moved across the paper suggested this kind of note was something she'd written before. Simple, direct, honest. She folded it once, placed it beside the cash, and took a step back. No theatrics, no glance over the shoulder. She left the office with the same unhurried steps she'd entered with. Benjamin waited for several more seconds, unsure what he was feeling, confused by the absence of deception, disoriented by the simplicity of her gesture. When he was certain she was gone, he rose, slowly, as if the ground beneath him had changed. Entering the office, he approached the desk. The stacks were neater than he'd ever left them. The note lay beside them, a little smudge of purple crayon in the corner. He opened it with the care one might give to a fragile object and read, "Mr. Walker, your money was all messy. I fixed it. Key team, Madison." It hit him harder than any betrayal ever had. This wasn't just innocence. It was trust in action. It was instinctive goodness, unmarred by the weight of consequence or the anticipation of reward. Madison had no idea he'd been watching. She had no need to impress him, no reason to prove anything. And yet she had done something that spoke louder than any adult apology ever could. Benjamin stood there, note in hand, heart hammering in his chest, not with rage or vindication, but with a sensation he barely recognized. Shame. He had suspected a child of theft. He had prepared to confirm her guilt. Instead, she had offered him grace. He folded the note carefully and placed it in his breast pocket, unsure why. Perhaps he already knew, somewhere beneath the years of armor, that this moment would return to him when he needed it most. Perhaps he feared forgetting it, but in truth he simply couldn't let go of it. And yet, as moving as that moment was, it was not the conclusion of the mystery. Later that evening, when the house quieted and Carmen had gone home, Benjamin returned to the office, not to lock the vault or count the cash, but to retrieve the camera footage. Something compelled him to watch again, not out of mistrust toward Madison anymore, but to see the moment replayed, to confirm that he hadn't imagined the purity of her actions. But as he rewound the footage past her departure, something else caught his eye. A shadow, a second figure. At 7:42 p.m., his wife, Alyssa, entered the room. Benjamin leaned forward, the blood draining from his face. There she was, poised, composed, unaware of the camera. She looked around once, then moved toward the vault like someone with nothing to hide. She entered the code he'd changed just that morning. And then, with quiet confidence, she slipped several bills into her designer handbag. Her lips barely moved, but they did curl into something like a smile. Benjamin paused the footage. For a long moment, he simply stared. All the pieces aligned, the vanished cash, the odd questions, the mounting charges on their shared accounts, the growing distance between them masked by designer perfumes and champagne brunches. It wasn't Madison. It never had been. It was Alyssa, the woman he had let into his home, his bed, his will. The realization was brutal, but what cut deeper was the contrast. That morning, he had suspected a child whose only offense was kindness. That night, he watched the woman he had married commit the theft he had feared. And somehow, it wasn't the betrayal that hurt the most. It was the fact that Madison's note, still tucked against his chest, had shown him what truth looked like. And now he could see the lie beside it. In that moment, something fundamental in Benjamin shifted. Not in anger, not in vengeance, but in grief. For all the years he'd wasted mistrusting the wrong people, for all the children he had once loved and lost, and for the little girl with crayons in her pocket who had just unknowingly restored a part of him that had long been gone. Night fell without ceremony. Benjamin didn't bother with dinner. He ignored the texts from Alyssa, asking if he wanted anything from the new Italian place, and let the silence settle around him. Sitting alone in his office, back straight, hands resting on the arms of the chair, he opened the hidden camera footage on his laptop. He was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that comes after something inside you has gone eerily still. He scrubbed through the timeline until Madison appeared on screen again. He watched her delicate hands straighten the scattered money, her head tilted in quiet focus, her small mouth humming something only she could hear. He let the footage run twice. No misstep, no hesitation. Just kindness so automatic it didn't even register as something to be proud of. For her, it was simply the right thing to do. That made him ache in a way he couldn't name. And then, just as she exited, he saw the timestamp. 7:42 p.m. That's when it began. Alyssa entered like she belonged there, which of course she did. That was part of what made it so disturbing. She didn't glance around nervously or flinch at the open vault. She walked in with the confidence of someone for whom the world had always bent to accommodate. Her heels clicked softly on the hardwood as she approached the desk, pulled open the drawer, then punched in the code to the vault keypad, his code, which he'd changed that very morning. The way she did it, casually, without hesitation, confirmed what he feared. This wasn't the first time. His heart thudded, not from surprise, but from the sharp, sudden shame of how long it had taken him to see her clearly. Alyssa took 3 stacks, maybe 4, slipped them into her handbag, then checked her lipstick in the reflection of the window as she walked out. Benjamin didn't pause the video. He let it play through the empty room for minutes afterward, as if watching the stillness would somehow undo what he'd just seen. But it didn't. He played it again, and again, 3 times, each time hoping absurdly that some detail would shift, that maybe he'd misread something, misunderstood a gesture, that there was some context he was missing. But no, it was all there, captured in the sterile coldness of the camera's eye. The way she moved through the space, the way she never once looked uncertain or conflicted, the absence of hesitation in her body language. It was surgical. Alyssa hadn't stumbled into a mistake. She had been methodically stealing from him, quietly, confidently, and consistently. Months, maybe longer. The trips to the city, the new jewelry that had no receipt, the spa weekends she claimed were gifts from her sister. Lies, all of it. Not just theft of money, but of intimacy, of partnership, of trust. The betrayal was complete. But what hit him hardest wasn't the money. It was what this theft revealed about how little he had meant to her. He didn't cry. There were no outbursts, no plates thrown against the wall, no whiskey poured into a glass to drown the disbelief. Benjamin had moved past that kind of reaction decades ago. What he felt now was a tightening of the soul, a retreat inward, a reorganization of truth. All the dinners, the soft hands on his chest at night, the effortless smile Alyssa had mastered. It had all been a play, a performance tailored to his needs, his guilt, his loneliness. She'd worn affection like a costume and collected dividends from his hope. And yet, even as that truth set in, it was Madison's name that surfaced in his mind. Madison, who had not been tested and passed, but who had passed simply by being who she was. No calculation, no performance, just instinctive decency. Benjamin stared at the envelope he had pulled from the safe earlier, where her note was tucked away. "Mr. Walker, your money was all messy. I fixed it. Madison." That crooked, smiley face at the end mocked him now, not because of her, but because of himself. He didn't sleep that night. He packed slowly, methodically, not his own things, hers, Alyssa's shoes, her jewelry, the coats she never wore but insisted on keeping just in case. Every drawer revealed something, receipts hidden, bank statements buried, proof of life she never shared with him. By dawn, the guest room bed was piled with her belongings, and on top, he placed a single envelope. Inside were two things: a printed still frame of the video and Madison's crayon note. No explanation, no accusations, just facts and contrast. One image of betrayal and one of honesty. One taken, one given. The message was silent but absolute. He didn't need to say goodbye, there was no point. When Alyssa came down that morning, eyes puffy with sleep, she froze at the sight of her packed life on display. She didn't ask any questions. She didn't argue. She simply picked up the envelope, opened it, and read. Her face changed, not dramatically, but enough. Enough for Benjamin to see that even she understood the finality of what had happened. And when she left, heels tapping against the stone steps like punctuation, she did so without a word, no plea, no denial, just a quiet acknowledgement of being seen. Benjamin stood by the window as her car pulled away, not out of longing, but out of necessity. He needed to witness the departure. Not of her body, but of what she'd represented, the last time he let illusion masquerade as love. And still, through all of it, through every frame of video and every beat of betrayal, it was the name scrawled in purple crayon that echoed in his mind. Madison. The child he had accused. The child who had unknowingly protected him. Madison, a name that now felt like a lifeline. A name he could no longer forget. By late afternoon, the house had fallen into a quiet that wasn't uncomfortable, but contemplative. Benjamin found himself walking through the corridor without purpose, as if led by something his mind hadn't caught up to yet. Then he saw her, Madison, sitting on the floor with her back to the wall, legs stretched out and a half-used notebook open in her lap. She was completely absorbed in her drawing, tongue slightly sticking out in concentration, her crayon moving carefully across the paper. He stopped a few feet away and watched in silence. She hadn't noticed him yet. The page revealed two rabbits side by side, one slightly larger than the other, both resting in a patch of bright green. There was no border, no sky, just the two of them, present and together. She colored with short, patient strokes, occasionally pulling back to assess her work before returning to it. For the first time in years, Benjamin felt the tightness in his chest release, not from anything grand or dramatic, but from the sheer normalcy of that moment. She had no idea what she had done. She didn't know that her quiet kindness had saved a man from slipping into bitterness so deep he'd forgotten what redemption even looked like. It was Carmen who broke the moment. She came around the corner carrying a basket of folded towels, her pace faltering the second she saw Benjamin standing there, eyes on her daughter. Her breath hitched ever so slightly, and she lowered her gaze, not from guilt, but shame. She hadn't slept well the night before. The weight of being silently suspected even for a moment was enough to unearth all the old insecurities she had fought to bury. Benjamin had always treated her with respect, sometimes even warmth, but the way he had called her into his office that morning, stoic, unreadable, made something twist inside her. She had known something was wrong. She just hadn't guessed it would reach her child. Her instinct now was to protect, to gather Madison into her arms and remove her from this place. "Mr. Walker," she began softly, her tone measured, rehearsed. "I think it might be best if I—" But he interrupted her, not with words, but with the simple raising of a hand, not aggressive, not abrupt, just enough to stop the spiral. He turned to face her fully, not the way he used to, briefly, distractedly, always through a lens of employer and employee, but truly looked at her. And for the first time, Carmen held that gaze. What she saw in his eyes wasn't suspicion or pity or even apology in the traditional sense. It was something quieter and heavier, acknowledgement. There was no speech, no ceremony, but the weight of that moment pressed into the space between them like something sacred. Benjamin's throat tightened, but he refused to look away. He had questioned the wrong people, allowed cynicism to override instinct, and it had nearly cost him the only genuine connection left in his home. Madison, still unaware of the exchange unfolding above her, continued drawing, now adding yellow dots around the rabbits, perhaps imagining flowers. Carmen blinked once, and though she didn't cry, she felt the tremor behind her ribs settle into something still. She nodded, just barely, and Benjamin gave the smallest incline of his head in return. It was a language of silence, spoken fluently by people who had endured too much to waste breath on ceremony. "I wasn't going to let her near it again," Carmen said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if each word cost her something. "The office, the safe, even the hallway. I didn't know what else to do." Benjamin let out a breath that wasn't quite a sigh. "She fixed it," he said simply. "The money. She organized it, and then she left me a note." Carmen blinked again, confused. "A note?" He nodded, with a smiley face drawn in crayon. There was a pause, then the faintest twitch of a smile at the corner of Carmen's mouth. It was involuntary, almost reflexive. "That sounds like her," she said. Benjamin's expression softened, but he said nothing more. Words, he realized, were inadequate currency when trust had been mishandled. What mattered now was not explaining the past, but choosing the future, moment by moment. Carmen understood this too. She stepped closer to Madison but didn't pick her up. Instead, she simply sat down beside her daughter, laying the towel basket gently beside her. Madison finally noticed them both, looked up and grinned. "Hi, Mama, I'm drawing rabbits." Carmen brushed a lock of hair behind Madison's ear. "I see that, baby. They look like they're friends." Madison nodded enthusiastically. "They are. They live in the same field and take naps together, so they don't feel lonely." Benjamin swallowed hard at that. He knelt down slowly, lowering himself to her eye level. "Why rabbits?" he asked, his voice rougher than usual, but not unkind. Madison shrugged, as if the answer was self-evident. "Because they don't talk much, but they still stay together." That answer hit harder than anything Alyssa had ever said to him. Carmen looked over at Benjamin, unsure whether she should say something, but she didn't need to. Madison had spoken for all of them. The drawing wasn't just a picture, it was a mirror, a declaration, a quiet offering. By the end of the day, Benjamin lingered longer in the corridor than he had any right to. He watched Madison shade the ears of the smaller rabbit a little darker and press her thumb over one crayon stroke to smudge it just so. She didn't know she had pulled a man back from the edge. She didn't know she had uncurled something broken inside his chest with nothing more than crayons and decency. Carmen rose eventually, took Madison's hand and guided her toward the kitchen. But Benjamin remained still, eyes fixed on the notebook she had left open on the floor. Two rabbits side by side in a green field. No border, no sky, just presence. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone in his own house. For the first time, he looked at Madison with something unguarded. Not suspicion, not gratitude, but heart. A true, complete heart. And in that look, in that weightless second, something unspoken passed between them, a kind of apology that only the silent ever truly understand. In the days that followed, something shifted, not in grand gestures or confessions, but in the quiet in-betweens. Benjamin, a man who had perfected the art of distance, began to notice things he had never given attention to before. He found a folded drawing tucked between the pages of a book in the library. A sun with a face, 3 stick figures standing beneath it, one tall, one medium, one small, with the name Maddie scrawled in pink marker at the bottom. Another time, he came across a napkin with doodles of stars and swirls beside the sugar jar in the kitchen. These weren't just messes, they were artifacts of a child's presence, breadcrumbs she left behind not for attention, but simply because she existed. He watched as Madison followed Carmen from room to room, humming while mimicking her mother's movements, folding towels, fluffing pillows, tapping the corners of books to align them neatly on shelves. It was the way she moved through his home without disturbing it, the way she respected its silence that struck him. And Benjamin realized he wasn't just seeing her now, he was beginning to look for her. Carmen noticed the change. She didn't comment on it directly, but she adjusted to the rhythm like a seasoned pianist picking up on a new harmony. When Madison lingered in the hallway, longer than usual, Carmen no longer rushed her along. When Benjamin passed through a room and paused to glance at whatever Madison was scribbling, she let it be. There was no need to interfere. One morning, Benjamin caught Madison rearranging the cushions in the sitting room. She didn't notice him at first, too focused on making sure they were perfectly symmetrical. He stood behind her, hands in his pockets, and cleared his throat gently. She turned, startled, but not afraid. "I like when things match," she said by way of explanation. "It makes the room feel like it's smiling." Benjamin had no response for that, just a small nod, but inside it echoed louder than anything he'd said in weeks. He found himself lingering longer in places he once rushed through, watching her with a cautious kind of curiosity, like someone observing a language he used to speak but had forgotten. The office door, once a barrier between him and the world, began to remain slightly open. At first, it was subconscious, a simple oversight. But when he found Madison's crayon sketch on his desk one morning, a simple drawing of a cat curled up next to a cup of coffee, he didn't move it. He placed it neatly beside the lamp like a keepsake. On another day, he heard her voice drift in from the hallway, asking Carmen why the books in the study didn't have pictures. Benjamin smiled to himself before catching the expression and forcing it away, as if smiling still felt like a betrayal of his usual restraint. Madison began peeking into the office more often, not quite entering, but hovering just outside, watching him as he worked. She didn't interrupt. Sometimes she waved, sometimes she left him little notes on sticky pads, "Have a good work," or "Your face is always serious, you should rest." He read every single one. He didn't keep them, but he remembered them. It was on a Tuesday afternoon that it happened. The house was quieter than usual, and Benjamin had just finished a call with his attorney. As he sat back in his chair, Madison appeared in the doorway, hesitant, holding something behind her back. "Mr. Walker?" she asked softly. He looked up. She stepped in, still cautious. "Can I play the piano just a little bit? I won't be loud." There was a pause. Benjamin didn't usually allow the piano to be touched. It hadn't been played since before the accident. But he found himself saying yes before the thought could catch up to the emotion. Madison's face lit up, not dramatically, just a subtle shift, a quiet kind of joy that made his chest ache. She tiptoed into the music room, as if afraid she might break something invisible. The piano bench creaked slightly as she climbed onto it. She lifted the fallboard with both hands and stared at the keys for a moment, as if they were a language she longed to speak but didn't quite know how. Then, with one tentative finger, she pressed a note. It rang out, uncertain but clear. She tried another, then two together. It wasn't music. It was noise, really, but not unpleasant. It was the sound of someone trying. Benjamin leaned against the doorframe and watched. She didn't notice him at first. She was lost in the moment, poking at combinations, tilting her head at the ones she liked. Then she began to hum, a tune with no origin, just something her mind made up to match the sounds. For Benjamin, it was less about what she played and more about what it evoked. It wasn't the first time he'd heard those keys. His daughter had once played them years ago. But it was the first time they'd felt like something alive again, something returning, one note at a time. And so the hesitant sound of piano notes echoed not through the room, but through something deeper inside him, something untouched for years. He didn't move, he didn't speak. He just stood there and listened, not to the music, but to the simple fact that she had asked, that he had said yes. And that now, in this room where silence had once been sacred, there was a new kind of sound, a living, imperfect, hopeful sound. Madison played until her hands got tired, then closed the lid gently and slid off the bench. She looked up at him, eyes searching. "Did I do okay?" she asked. Benjamin nodded. "You did just fine," he said. And as she smiled and skipped out of the room, Benjamin sat down slowly on the bench she had just left. His fingers hovered above the keys, but didn't touch them. He didn't need to. The music had already started again. Madison couldn't play. Not really. She didn't know scales or chords, and her fingers stumbled often, unsure of which key came next. But that didn't stop her. She sat at the grand piano like someone sitting at a campfire for the first time, unsure of how to feed the flame, but enchanted by the warmth of it. Her small hands hovered, then pressed one note at a time, pausing between them to hear how they echoed against each other. She didn't rush. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. There was no audience, only her own curiosity and the strange sense of peace that came from creating something, even if imperfect. Sometimes she pressed two keys together, and if they clashed, she laughed softly and tried again. It was trial and error, pure exploration, and while the melody she played made little musical sense, it carried something far more rare: presence. She was there. She was alive in the moment. And just outside the room, Benjamin leaned against the wall, listening, unmoving, breathing slowly, and crying, not out of sorrow, but from something older, deeper, messier, something he had hidden so successfully he thought it had died. He didn't remember when the last time was that he cried. Maybe when Julia was buried, maybe when he first walked back into the empty house and found her shoes still lined up at the foot of the stairs, untouched. The memory came now, as if summoned by the sound of Madison's inconsistent notes. Julia had been the same age, 8 years old, curious, bright. Her laugh used to echo through this very hallway. She had loved to sing, though she was always slightly off-key. Benjamin hadn't minded. He used to tell her that music wasn't about perfection, it was about honesty. He had forgotten that until now. Alyssa never knew about Julia. None of the women he had dated, loved, or married afterward had ever heard her name. He kept it that way. It was easier to erase the pain than to invite more of it in. He buried himself in numbers, deals, mergers, capital. Everything with a bottom line, everything measurable. Grief, though, wasn't measurable. It lingered in corners, came in waves, showed up in moments like this, unexpected, disarming, true. And as Madison stumbled through what could loosely be called a tune, Benjamin felt that carefully constructed fortress begin to fracture. He stayed outside the room not because he didn't want to go in, but because something about that distance felt right. Madison didn't know she was performing. She didn't know she was healing someone. She wasn't trying to be anyone's daughter or symbol. She was just a girl pressing keys, letting the sound be enough, and that's what made it unbearable and beautiful. Benjamin wiped his face with the sleeve of his sweater, angry with himself for breaking down so easily. But it wasn't weakness. It was memory, pouring out of the locked drawers of his chest. He thought of the car accident, of the late-night call from the hospital, of the way he couldn't bring himself to see Julia's body, even when the doctors said it was important. He had said no. He had refused. Because some part of him had already begun the process of shutting down, sealing off, surviving. And he had survived, financially, socially, but not emotionally, not as a father. He had failed in silence, quietly disappearing into himself. And now, 20 years later, it was the sound of one child trying to find music in chaos that brought it all back. At one point, Madison struck a chord that somehow sounded right. She paused and repeated it, then again, 3 times. A pattern. Benjamin recognized it. Not the notes, but the effort. Julia used to do the same thing when she stumbled on something that felt right to her ears. She would chase it, build on it, let it grow into something her own. Benjamin exhaled, slowly. He wondered if Madison would ever know how close she was to resurrecting something buried with the dead. She wasn't Julia. He knew that. But she didn't have to be. She was Madison, fierce in her own quiet way, unknowingly stitching together parts of a man who hadn't realized how broken he was. It wasn't just her music that did it. It was her presence, her simple fearlessness. She had asked to play, and he had said yes. That yes was still echoing inside him, louder than any song she could play. Eventually, the notes stopped. Madison rested her hands on the keys, her head tilted, as if listening for something deeper beneath the sound. Benjamin straightened, brushing the last trace of tears from his face. He wasn't ready to enter the room yet, not with red eyes, not with all that unspoken history swelling in his chest. So he turned and stepped away quietly, leaving her alone with the instrument. She would never know what she had done. She would never see the ghosts she'd chased out just by pressing keys. But that was okay. Not all healing needed to be acknowledged. Some of it just needed to be allowed, and for the first time in years, Benjamin found himself thinking about music again, not in terms of melody or rhythm, but as memory, as truth, as something that couldn't be negotiated or traded or buried beneath contracts. Just something that stayed, like the notes she had left in the air. Madison didn't know how to play, but she played anyway, finger by finger, note by note. Benjamin, standing on the other side of the door, listened, and he cried, not just for Julia, who had died 20 years ago at the same age, in the same city, in the same world, but for himself. The man who had spent decades pretending that pain could be outlived. Alyssa had never known about that chapter of his life. No woman ever had. He had sealed it away beneath schedules, spreadsheets, and silence. But Madison, with her clumsy music and her stubborn focus, had unknowingly peeled back a corner of that armor. And from beneath it, something long buried began to rise. Slowly, hesitantly, like a song remembering how to be sung. The morning started like any other, which is why the impact hit harder. Rain streaked down the windows in quiet rhythms, and Benjamin, halfway through his second cup of coffee, retreated to his study, not out of urgency, but out of habit. The house had been unusually still that morning, and Carmen was in the laundry room, humming softly while sorting linens. Madison was somewhere, likely in the hallway, drawing or following her mother, as she often did. Benjamin had opened his desk drawer to grab a pen when his hand brushed against something soft and uneven. Paper. Folded. He didn't remember leaving anything there. Pulling it out slowly, he recognized the now familiar crayon marks before even unfolding it. A drawing, childlike, colorful, honest. And without knowing why, his breath caught. The page showed a sketch of the house, his house, but not cold and distant like it so often felt. In this version, it had flowers lining the edges, smoke curling from the chimney, and, on the porch, 3 stick figures. One tall, one medium, one small. Above them, scrawled in uneven, determined letters, "Real home." He stared at it, unmoving. His heart didn't race. It slowed, as if trying to process what his mind already knew. He sat back slowly in the chair, the paper resting in his palm, like something alive. He stared at it for longer than he realized, tracing the outlines with his eyes, trying to find flaws, maybe, or signs that it was meant to be a joke. But there was nothing ironic about it. It was sincere, pure. Painfully so. Madison hadn't even given it to him directly. She'd just left it there unannounced, as if it were normal to declare something that big without a word. Maybe for her it was. Benjamin's throat tightened as he read the words again. Real home. It wasn't just the drawing that got to him. It was the placement. She could have handed it to him, she could have showed it off proudly, but instead she hid it. Like something private, something she wasn't sure he'd want to see, something that mattered too much to risk rejection. That's what broke him, that she wasn't asking for anything, that she didn't even expect it to be found. It was a truth she left behind for herself, one that he happened to stumble upon, and it changed everything. He stood up, letter still in hand, and walked toward the tall bookshelf in the corner. His steps were slow, deliberate, and heavy with memory. There was a drawer there, one he hadn't opened in years. A narrow compartment built into the base of the shelf, barely noticeable unless you knew where to press. It had been untouched for 2 decades. The key had always stayed in the top drawer of his desk, beneath a false bottom. He retrieved it without thinking. The metal felt colder than he expected. The lock clicked open with a stiffness that suggested time had tried to keep it sealed. Inside were photographs, a stuffed elephant, a music box missing its crank, and letters, all addressed to Julia, his daughter, his only child, dead before she ever got to double digits. He sank to the floor, letter still clutched in one hand, while his other reached for the photos. He didn't cry, not immediately. First, he studied. The freckles, the messy ponytails, the pink dress she used to twirl in. She had stood in this house too once, in those very hallways, laughing, singing, asking impossible questions. Her absence had become the architecture of his life, and now something had cracked it open. He didn't know how long he stayed there, maybe minutes, maybe an hour. The rain hadn't let up outside, and Carmen hadn't come looking for him. Madison hadn't either, and he was grateful for that. This wasn't a moment meant to be shared. It was something private, sacred, a reckoning. All these years, he had avoided these things, the drawer, the grief, the possibility that healing might come from places he didn't expect. He had told himself he was protecting Julia's memory by locking it away, but really, he'd been protecting himself from the guilt of moving on, from the shame of surviving her, from the terrifying thought that something good could come after her. But now, the drawing in his lap told a different story, not one of replacement, but of reawakening. Madison wasn't filling a void. She was revealing one he'd pretended didn't exist. Her presence wasn't erasing Julia. It was reminding him that he was still here, that he still had the capacity to feel, to protect, to choose. Eventually, he placed the old photographs back in the drawer, careful this time. Not like before, when he shoved them in as if trying to bury them deeper than the dead. This time, his hands were slow, respectful. He set the drawing, Madison's drawing, on top of everything else, before closing the drawer gently and locking it again. Not out of denial, but preservation. He wasn't hiding it. He was giving it a place. Something about that felt right, final. He slipped the key back into the desk, but not beneath the false bottom. It stayed visible now, where he could reach it easily. As he returned to his seat, he stared at the space on his desk where the letter had been. He wondered how many more she'd leave behind, and whether he was ready to find them. On a rainy morning, Madison had left a folded letter on his desk. Benjamin had found it by accident. Inside, a drawing of the house, with 3 people on the porch: himself, Madison, and Carmen. Above them, in crooked, hopeful letters, she'd written, "Real home." The words unraveled something buried deep in him. He placed the drawing into a drawer that hadn't been opened in 20 years, the same drawer where he had locked away the photographs of his dead daughter. And for the first time in decades, that drawer no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a doorway. It happened quickly, without warning, the way some truths do. Carmen had been folding a heavy load of towels in the laundry room, something she'd done 1,000 times before, when her knees simply buckled beneath her. No sound, no cry, just a dull thud as her body met the tile. Madison had found her. The child's scream shattered the calm of the house like a hammer through glass. Benjamin had been upstairs reviewing legal documents when he heard it. He didn't hesitate. He didn't shout for help. He ran. Not with the stiffness of age or the caution of pride, but like a father who knows what it means to lose someone. He found Carmen crumpled on the floor, unconscious but breathing, her hand still clutching part of a towel. Madison was kneeling beside her, sobbing and begging her to wake up. "Mommy, please, Mommy." Her little hands kept touching her mother's face, unsure of what would help. Benjamin scooped Madison up, gently moved her aside, and called for an ambulance. But halfway through the call, he made a decision. He was done waiting for people. He picked up Carmen himself. Madison followed, still crying, still pleading, and Benjamin drove. He didn't say a word during the drive to the hospital. Not because there was nothing to say, but because too much was sitting inside his chest, clogging the passage between his thoughts and his voice. Carmen was laid out across the back seat, pale and unmoving. Madison sat in the front, her legs curled beneath her, her thumb in her mouth, a habit Benjamin hadn't seen before. She hadn't asked questions. She hadn't tried to speak. The silence between them wasn't cold, it was loaded, sacred. Every few minutes, Benjamin reached his hand across the center console and rested it gently on Madison's knee. She didn't flinch. She didn't even look at him, but she leaned slightly toward the warmth. At a red light, he turned to look at her. "She's going to be okay," he said, his voice hoarse. Madison didn't answer. She just nodded slowly, as if trying to convince herself of the same thing. And Benjamin thought with a sharp pang how wrong it was that a child should be asked to carry such a fear. She was only 8. She shouldn't have to know how fragile mothers can be. The hospital was a blur of fluorescent lights and clipped voices. A nurse took Carmen from his arms, and for the first time since Julia's accident 20 years earlier, Benjamin walked through those halls not as a bystander, but as someone deeply invested. He didn't hand off responsibility. He followed. He insisted on staying through the intake. When they asked for emergency contact information, he gave his own. When they asked if Carmen had insurance, he simply said, "Bill me." Madison sat slumped on the waiting room bench, silent but wide awake, her small body folded like a paper crane. She didn't cry anymore. She just waited. When the nurse told them Carmen was stable but needed rest and observation, Benjamin felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. Guilt that it had taken a collapse for him to realize just how much Carmen had carried, not just the weight of his home, but the emotional weight of everyone inside it. And he hadn't seen it. Or worse, maybe he had, and chose not to look too closely. That thought stayed with him longer than it should have. Later, when Carmen was finally asleep in a quiet hospital room, Benjamin sat beside her. He didn't speak to her. She was still groggy, still distant, but he held her hand, not out of obligation, out of something else, something unfamiliar and entirely too intimate. He didn't look away when her fingers twitched slightly in his grasp. Madison had curled up on the visitor's chair across from them, her head resting on a crumpled hoodie. She had finally fallen asleep, lips slightly parted, one hand still clutching the stuffed rabbit Benjamin had bought her weeks ago without admitting it was from him. The nurse had offered to call someone else to take Madison home. Benjamin refused. "We're staying," he said. "Both of us." No one questioned him. There was no need to explain what had already become obvious. This wasn't just a housekeeper and her daughter anymore. This was something else. Something fragile, yes, but undeniably real. He looked at Carmen's face and thought about how many mornings she had arrived before sunrise, how many nights she had stayed late without complaint. And now, here she was, unconscious in a hospital bed, because none of them, especially him, had thought to ask how she was doing. It wasn't until the drive back home that the full weight of it settled into Benjamin's chest. Carmen had been right in front of him all these years, and he had never truly seen her. Not like this, not with gratitude. And Madison, she was no longer just a child in the house. She was a part of something now, of him. That realization frightened him in a way nothing else had, not even betrayal, not even death. He had kept people out for so long that letting them in felt like walking barefoot across broken glass. But there it was, plain as day, this improbable trio had become a unit, a small, wounded, stitched-together kind of family. He hadn't planned it. He hadn't wanted it. But now he couldn't imagine the house without them. The idea of walking into that big, echoing structure without Carmen's quiet footsteps or Madison's drawings on the fridge felt empty, pointless. He glanced in the rearview mirror at Madison, still asleep in the back seat now, hugging her knees. And something inside him let go of its fear, not all at once, but enough to feel it. Carmen had fainted in the laundry room. They said it was stress or exhaustion, or maybe the fear of losing her job. Benjamin had driven her to the hospital himself, holding her hand the whole time while Madison slept on the bench nearby. He hadn't felt this responsible for another human being since losing his own family. And in the silence of the drive home, with Madison breathing quietly in the back seat, he realized something he hadn't dared to admit until now. That the three of them, this unlikely patched-together trio, had become part of each other. And for the first time in years, that didn't scare him. The storm hit overnight, violent and uninvited, tearing through Connecticut like a force that didn't care for time, wealth, or property lines. By morning, a portion of the mansion's east wing roof had collapsed under the weight of wind and rain. Water had seeped through insulation, down walls, soaking into priceless wooden beams. Carmen, still recovering from her recent collapse, was advised by both her doctor and Benjamin to stay with her sister in Stamford until things stabilized. She resisted at first, felt guilty, uncertain, but Benjamin was firm. "Go rest. We'll manage," he said, his voice steady and final. It was the first time he had ever referred to himself and Madison as a we. The girl had looked up at him from the foot of the stairs and nodded, as if understanding that something different was beginning, not just in the house, but between them. He didn't have a plan for how they'd manage. He only knew he didn't want Madison to feel like an accessory to someone else's home. He wanted her to know she belonged, even if he didn't quite know how to say it. The first morning alone, Benjamin decided he would make breakfast. He wasn't entirely sure why, perhaps because it was something tangible, something immediate, something that showed he was trying. He had never made pancakes before. The result was a disaster, unevenly cooked, parts blackened, parts soggy, and a sticky mess of batter on the counter. He stared at the plate in defeat. "They look like sad hats," Madison said, standing behind him, one eyebrow raised. He turned, almost embarrassed, but her face was neutral, curious, not critical. "Well," he muttered, "they taste slightly better than they look." She took a bite without protest, then looked at him and nodded. "You tried," she said. "That counts a lot more than you think." He didn't know what to say to that. No one had ever thanked him for trying, only for succeeding. That was the currency of the world he knew. But this little girl had just assigned value to effort, and that for him was disarming. After breakfast, Madison disappeared into the sunroom with a handful of markers and paper. Benjamin assumed she was drawing, the way she often did when things were quiet. He gave her space, but checked in every so often, not with words, but by passing nearby or placing a snack beside her elbow. Mid-afternoon, she appeared at his office door with a folded piece of paper and an awkward smile. "For you," she said, and handed it to him. It was a card, front cover decorated with uneven hearts, flowers with faces, and one lopsided sun in the corner. Inside, she had written in jagged block letters, "Thank you for pancakes even when they were burned. You tried, and I like that. Love, Madison." He sat with the card in his hands for a long time after she left the room. It felt heavier than any document he'd ever signed, more permanent than any contract. He didn't put it in a drawer. He placed it beside the framed photo of Julia on the desk, his daughter, whose presence still lingered like a shadow. Madison wasn't replacing Julia, but she was creating something else, a new space, not instead, just beside. They spent the next few evenings reading by flashlight and candlelight while electricians worked on the damaged wiring. Benjamin found himself looking forward to her commentary, her wildly imaginative questions, her side remarks about characters and villains. One night, she asked him why grown-ups always tried to fix things by throwing them away. Sometimes, she said, things aren't broken. They're just waiting for someone to see them right. He didn't know how to respond to that, so instead, he laughed. A real, surprised laugh that felt like it came from someone else's throat. Madison laughed too, more from seeing him do it than from her own words. It became a rhythm. She'd say something strange and sincere, and he'd laugh or nod, and the silence between them would shrink a little more. They didn't talk about the storm or the broken roof or the absence of Carmen. They didn't need to. What was forming between them wasn't built from shared pasts, but from present gestures, meals, drawings, books, and burned pancakes. The pieces of something unspoken began falling into place. It was during one of these quiet nights, as Benjamin marked a page in the book they were reading, that Madison stood up abruptly and crossed the room. She wrapped her arms around his torso, resting her head against his chest. The gesture was unexpected, not hesitant, but not overly bold either. It felt instinctive, like she had decided it was time. Benjamin froze, unsure of what to do with his arms, with his breath, with his heart that now seemed to beat twice as loudly. Then slowly, he rested his hand on her back. She whispered something against his sweater, barely audible. "Can you come to the meeting at my school?" she asked. "Next Thursday, we have to bring someone who knows us." Her voice was smaller than usual, almost cautious, like she was afraid he'd say no, not out of cruelty, but out of habit. Benjamin didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. The way his arms stayed around her, the way he pulled her just slightly closer, said more than yes ever could. A storm had struck Connecticut and torn part of the mansion's roof. Carmen had to stay away for a few days. That left Benjamin and Madison alone. He made terrible pancakes. She gave him a thank you card anyway. Between flashlight-lit stories and laughter neither of them had expected, something began to shift. Not friendship, not replacement, but recognition. At the end of it all, Benjamin looked down at the girl who had become a quiet force in his life, and with a laugh still clinging to his chest, called her Little Flower of Chaos. Madison responded not with words, but a hug that lingered, and then with a whisper, "Will you come to the meeting at my school?" He went. There was no last-minute hesitation, no pacing at the doorway, no inner battle. When Thursday arrived, Benjamin Walker, dressed in silence, buttoned his shirt with the precision of someone who used to care how others perceived him, and drove himself to Madison's school. He parked farther away than necessary, out of old instinct. As he stepped through the double doors, he felt like a misplaced artifact, too polished, too formal, too him. Inside the cafeteria, a sea of parents buzzed with the loud hum of conversations, plastic chairs scraping, toddlers crying, teachers giving directions no one really followed. He hadn't been in a school building since Julia's memorial service. The irony wasn't lost on him. Benjamin chose the last row, keeping his head slightly bowed so the inevitable stares would pass quicker. He didn't recognize anyone, and that was a comfort. He wasn't here for them. He was here because a little girl had asked him to come, because she'd looked at him and called it knowing, because he'd said yes with his presence long before he arrived. The assembly moved quickly, kids presenting art projects, awkward science demonstrations, a short musical number where one child accidentally kicked over a cymbal. Laughter erupted. Benjamin didn't laugh, but he smiled. Then the teacher called for the final part of the evening, a student presentation called "The Person I Admire Most." Madison's name was called. Benjamin sat up straighter, not because he expected anything, but because something inside him needed to witness this, whatever it was. Madison walked slowly to the front, wearing a red dress and her hair tied back in uneven braids. Carmen must have done that morning. She didn't seem nervous. She didn't stumble or rush. She just stood in front of the microphone and opened a folded piece of paper. "The person I admire most," she began, "is someone honest, someone who helps without asking for anything back. She's always there when I need her. She makes me feel safe, and she tells me the truth even when it's hard." Benjamin didn't breathe for a moment. A small voice in the back of his mind, one he hated to admit existed, wondered if she was talking about him. Maybe this was one of those moments where things shifted, where someone tells you that you mattered, that you saved them. But then Madison continued. "Her name is Carmen Ellis. She's my mom." She paused and smiled, then glanced around the room. "She's the most honest person I know." There was applause, the kind children receive regardless of what they say, and Benjamin joined in quietly. There was no sting, no disappointment. Madison had said nothing about him. She hadn't even hinted, and yet when she returned to her seat, she turned her head slightly, just enough to find him in the last row, and smiled. Not a performative smile, not a "thank you for coming" smile, but something quieter, deeper. It said, "I saw you. I knew you'd come. That was enough." That smile did more for Benjamin than 1,000 words of praise ever could. It was the kind of smile that settles inside a person and reshapes something that had been rigid for too long. He realized then that he didn't need to be chosen in some grand public way. He didn't need to be the story's hero or the center of attention. He needed only to be there, present, reliable, quietly counted on. He watched her laugh with the kids next to her, proud but not boastful, comfortable in her skin. Carmen wasn't there. She'd had to work a double shift, but Madison didn't seem alone. That hit him harder than expected. Not because she didn't need him, but because he realized he didn't need to be needed in order to love. Love, in its realest form, wasn't about recognition. It was about presence. After the event, parents filed out in loose, disorganized lines. Benjamin stayed seated, waiting for the room to thin. He didn't approach Madison. She was talking to her teacher, showing off her paper with a grin. He watched from afar, unnoticed by most, and for once he was fine with that. A child had stood in front of a crowd and declared her mother the most honest person she knew, and she was right. Carmen had never claimed more than what was hers, had never asked for acknowledgement, and yet had earned the deepest kind. Benjamin felt proud. Not possessively, not out of some proxy role, but genuinely proud to be connected to both of them, to be a thread in the quiet fabric they were weaving together, one meal, one card, one meeting at a time. He had gone. He had sat in the last row, surrounded by loud, distracted parents who didn't recognize the silent ache that had brought him there. He watched Madison speak about the most honest person she knew. She hadn't named him. She'd named Carmen. But at the end of it, she looked straight at him and smiled. That smile said everything. He didn't need to be her hero. He only needed to be there. And for the first time in years, the world outside the walls of his mansion made sense again. Months had passed since the school assembly, and the mansion felt different in ways that couldn't be measured by furniture placement or lighting. Benjamin Walker, once a man who operated his life like a sealed vault, had begun to allow movement, softness, and, unexpectedly, presence. It was during one of his quiet afternoons that the idea came. He had been walking through the old music room, the same room where Madison used to tap random piano keys with more heart than skill, when he paused, his fingers resting on the doorknob. The room no longer represented music. It represented something far rarer. healing. That space had witnessed the cracking of his walls, the beginning of something both terrifying and redemptive. So, he called the contractor who had remodeled his office years ago and said without much explanation, "I need a nameplate for a door. And it has to be in a child's handwriting." The man didn't question it. Benjamin had kept one of Madison's old doodles, where she had signed her name in loopy, uneven letters. He scanned it, sent it over, and 2 weeks later, a bronze plaque arrived. Madison's room. He held it for a long time before calling Carmen into the hallway. When Carmen arrived, she looked tired from her morning shift, a little confused about why Benjamin had asked her to come upstairs. He gestured toward the door, but didn't say a word. She stepped closer and saw it. Her hand went to her mouth before any words could escape. Madison's room. Written exactly the way her daughter spelled it, with the S a little crooked and the final an exaggerated like a tail. It wasn't a guest room anymore. It wasn't a borrowed corner of the mansion where a child passed time while her mother worked. It had been renamed, claimed. Carmen turned to Benjamin, her voice breaking with the weight of years lived in the background. "You didn't have to do this." He looked at her, truly looked, the way he had learned to over the past months. "I did," he said, "because she's already changed this house. It was only right to let the house show it back." Carmen's eyes welled up, but she said nothing more. Sometimes gratitude is too big for words. Madison was at school that day. She hadn't seen the plaque yet. Benjamin decided he wouldn't tell her. He wanted her to find it on her own. That night, while the house settled into its usual rhythm, Benjamin sat at the dining room table with an envelope in front of him. It was heavier than it looked, not because of the papers inside, but because of what they meant. Legal documents, properly signed, prepared by his lawyer and notarized the week before. A petition for legal guardianship of Madison Ellis. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't made on a whim or out of some inflated sense of redemption. It had been months in the making, thought through, debated in long, silent evenings. He had talked to Carmen at length. She had cried. She had resisted at first. But in the end, they had agreed. If anything ever happened to her, Benjamin was the only person she trusted with her daughter. And more than that, Carmen understood what Benjamin was trying to do, not replace her, not adopt out of pity, but honor the bond that had formed. That night, he knocked gently on Madison's door, her real door now, and asked if he could talk to her. She was coloring, wearing mismatched socks and humming some tune off-key. "Sure," she said, patting the edge of the bed like she always did when inviting someone into her world. He handed her the envelope without explaining too much. "This is just something important, something for you and your mom." Madison opened it clumsily, frowning at the complicated language and stiff paper. She didn't understand what legal guardian meant. She didn't read far. But she saw her name, she saw Benjamin's signature, and she saw a photo tucked into the back, one Carmen had insisted they add, of the three of them on the back porch, Madison sitting in the middle with their arms around her. Madison looked up at Benjamin, her face puzzled. "So, what does this mean? Are we like a real family now?" Her voice cracked slightly, like she was afraid the question would make the moment too fragile. Benjamin opened his mouth but found himself unable to say anything. His throat burned. His eyes were wet before he even realized they were filling. So he did the only thing he could. He nodded, pulled her into a hug, and let the silence speak for him. Madison stayed wrapped in his arms longer than usual. She didn't cry. She didn't giggle. She just rested her head against his shoulder and let herself be held. "Okay," she whispered after a while. "Then I guess I can call this home now." Benjamin closed his eyes. For a man who had built empires, who had survived betrayals and watched love rot into transaction, that was the moment he had unknowingly been building toward all along. He had called it protection, caution, control. But what he had really been doing, brick by emotional brick, was rebuilding the possibility of family, of belonging. Carmen walked in moments later, having heard nothing but sensing everything. She didn't interrupt. She just stood by the door and watched her daughter choose trust again, choose love again, and choose him. The next morning, Madison woke up early and went to the hallway like she always did before school. She rubbed her eyes, dragging her little feet behind her, and paused mid-step. Her eyes landed on the door. She blinked once, then again. And then she saw it. Her name cast in bronze, forever etched in the language only love knows how to speak. Madison's room. The letters were hers. The spelling, the curves, the tiny flaws that made it hers. She didn't say anything. Just stared for a long moment, the weight of the gesture washing over her like sunlight through thick clouds. And in that silence, Benjamin saw her, and she saw him. No need for speeches, no need for declarations. A plaque on a door had said everything. In the bronze reflection, she asked, "So now we're a real family?" Benjamin didn't respond with words, but in his eyes, steady, certain, full of something he hadn't known how to give for decades, was the answer. And it was yes. We put our heart into every story we share here, and this one was no exception. If Madison and Mr. Walker's journey touched something in you, consider subscribing to our channel. It truly helps us keep bringing you more stories crafted with care and meaning. Drop a comment below. We read every single one and would love to hear your thoughts. And if this video moved you, don't forget to give it a like. Thank you for being part of this community. We're so grateful to have you with us.